My ex-wife is a real. She took out a $10,000 loan in my name, and when she found out I had $300,000, she tried to take a share through the court. Without helping our children, she only demanded money from me. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to share this story, but after some reflection, I figured it might help to talk about it. 13 years ago, I finalized my divorce from my ex-wife, Sophie, and even after all this time, the ripple effects still leave me reeling. Sophie and I met in our early 20s. At first, she seemed like everything I was looking for. Charming, confident, full of plans for the future. We got married when I was 27, and within a few years, we had two incredible kids. Alice, who's now 16, and Luke, who just turned 14. I've always done my best to keep things peaceful for their sake, but getting along with Sophie has been one of the biggest challenges of my life. Even before we got married, there were red flags I ignored. Sophie had this way of twisting the truth to suit her needs. At first, it was small stuff, like inconsistent stories about her childhood or why she left certain jobs. Over time, it became more obvious, blaming others for things she'd clearly caused, manipulating situations to her advantage, or just flat out lying when it got her what she wanted. But I was younger, naive, and convinced I could help her. Our marriage started unraveling after a few years. We argued constantly about finances, parenting decisions, and even basic household responsibilities. Sophie had a tendency to overspend, always justifying it with some grand excuse. Meanwhile, I worked long hours to cover the bills, often feeling like I was pulling double duty as both a provider and a parent. It wasn't just the financial strain. Sophie's unpredictability made it hard to trust her with anything important. When things hit a breaking point, I knew I had to end it, but Sophie didn't make it easy. The divorce process dragged on for over a year. Every time we seemed close to an agreement, Sophie would change her demands or accuse me of something absurd to stall the process. It felt less like she wanted a fair outcome and more like she just wanted to wear me down. After countless sleepless nights and stressful court appearances, we finally reached a settlement. We agreed on 50-50 custody of the kids and decided to share their expenses equally. Neither of us would pay alimony, which was a relief at the time, though I've since realized it was just another manipulation tactic on Sophie's part. She wanted to avoid being on record for anything that could hold her accountable. Adjusting to the custody arrangement was tough. The kids were still young. Alice was only 3, and Luke was just a baby. Splitting time between two homes was confusing for them at first. I did my best to create a stable environment, making sure their schedules stayed consistent and their needs were met. Sophie, on the other hand, often treated her custody weeks as her time rather than focusing on the kids. There were instances when I'd pick them up, and they'd tell me they'd spent most of the week with babysitters while Sophie went out. Despite the agreement to share expenses, money became a recurring battleground. Sophie frequently forgot to contribute her share for things like daycare or school fees. She always had an excuse. She'd lost track of the bill, had an unexpected expense, or blamed me for not reminding her. I ended up covering a lot of costs just to avoid the stress of fighting with her. At one point, I even considered going back to court to revisit the terms, but I couldn't handle the thought of reliving the nightmare. As the years went on, Sophie's lies and manipulations didn't stop. There was one instance when Alice needed braces. I emailed Sophie about the cost and asked if she could split it with me. She agreed over email, but then ghosted me when the bill was due. When I confronted her, she claimed she'd never agreed to anything and accused me of trying to scam her. I ended up paying the full amount myself because Alice needed the braces, and I couldn't let her suffer because of Sophie's games. Even more shocking was the time Sophie tried to take me back to court, claiming I wasn't upholding the custody agreement. She accused me of keeping the kids longer than my allotted time, which wasn't true. I documented every pickup and drop-off meticulously because I knew Sophie's tendency to twist reality. When I presented my records in court, the judge dismissed her case, but the stress of defending myself was overwhelming. Through all of this, I've tried to shield Alice and Luke from the worst of it. They're old enough now to see some of Sophie's behavior for what it is, but I never speak badly about her to them. They deserve to have their own relationship with their mom, even if it's complicated. Still, there are moments when they'll come to me with frustrations about Sophie, and it's hard not to feel bitter. 13 years later, I've rebuilt a good life for myself. I've found stability, a supportive partner, and a career that lets me provide for the kids. But there are still days when I look back and wonder how I let myself get caught in Sophie's web for so long. The divorce may have ended the marriage, but the fallout has been an ongoing battle, one I fight every day to make sure my kids are okay. After the dust of the divorce settled, I knew one thing for sure. I had to protect Alice and Luke's future. Watching Sophie's chaotic approach to money during our marriage had taught me an invaluable lesson. If I didn't take responsibility for their financial security, no one else would. I wasn't just planning for their college or first cars. I was preparing for whatever curveballs life might throw at them. Little did I know, those curveballs would come much sooner than expected. 13 years ago, life handed me two major windfalls, $200,000 from a workplace injury settlement and $100,000 from a distant aunt's inheritance. These funds were unexpected blessings, and I vowed not to squander them. I wanted them to be a safety net for the kids, a promise that no matter what Sophie did, or didn't do, they'd have opportunities one could only dream of as a child. The injury settlement was a turning point. I had worked in construction for most of my 20s, a job I loved despite the risks. But one rainy afternoon, a scaffolding failure changed everything. I fell nearly 20 feet, breaking my leg in 3 places and fracturing my wrist. The recovery was grueling. Months of physical therapy, surgeries, and living with a metal rod in my leg that still aches when the weather changes. While the accident ended my days on the job site, it also led to the compensation that became the cornerstone of my financial plan for Alice and Luke. The inheritance was even more unexpected. Aunt Margaret was a distant relative on my father's side, someone I'd met maybe twice in my life. She lived in a tiny Midwestern town, kept to herself, and apparently had no close family. When she passed away, I was shocked to learn she'd left me $100,000. The letter from her lawyer explained that she admired my commitment to my kids. She'd seen photos and heard stories through mutual family connections and wanted to help in some small way. I still get choked up thinking about her generosity. With $300,000 in hand, I started researching the best way to save for the kids. I consulted financial advisors, read countless articles, and even attended a few community seminars on college savings plans. Ultimately, I decided on a combination of savings accounts and 529 college savings plans. Every dollar was earmarked for their future, tuition, down payments, emergencies, whatever they might need. It felt good to finally have a sense of control after years of financial chaos with Sophie. Of course, Sophie found a way to complicate things. When she heard about the settlement, thanks to Alice innocently mentioning it, she called me, demanding her share. She claimed that since I'd gotten hurt while we were still married, she was entitled to part of the money. I reminded her that the divorce agreement had already settled everything, and she had no legal claim to the funds. Her response? A tirade of insults and thinly veiled threats about taking me back to court. I stood my ground, but the stress of dealing with her was a reminder of why I had to be so careful with the money. The first real test of my financial planning came when Alice turned 12. She'd always been a bright, ambitious kid, and she was accepted into an advanced STEM summer program that cost nearly $5,000. I was thrilled for her but knew Sophie would balk at contributing. True to form, when I brought it up, Sophie laughed and said, "You've got all that settlement money. Why should I chip in?" I didn't even bother arguing. I paid for the program, and Alice thrived. Watching her confidence grow was worth every penny. Not long after, Luke needed braces. The orthodontist quoted us $6,000, and once again, Sophie refused to help. Her excuse this time? She was saving up for a family vacation with her new boyfriend, Brian, a guy she'd been dating for about 6 months. The irony wasn't lost on me. She couldn't contribute to her son's medical needs, but had no problem splurging on a trip to Cancun. I paid for the braces, just as I had for Alice's STEM program, and quietly added the expense to my mental tally of Sophie's failures. Despite these frustrations, I stayed focused on the bigger picture. I made it a point to teach Alice and Luke about financial responsibility. When Alice got her first part-time job at 15, I helped her open a savings account and explained the importance of budgeting. Luke, who's more of a spender by nature, took a bit more convincing, but he eventually came around. I wanted them to understand that the money I'd saved wasn't just a blank check. It was a foundation for them to build on. But just when I thought I'd seen the worst of Sophie's antics, she pulled her most shocking stunt yet. Last year, I discovered she'd taken out a credit card in Luke's name. I only found out because Luke started getting calls from debt collectors, which confused and terrified him. When I confronted Sophie, she denied everything at first, then claimed it was a harmless mistake. Harmless? She'd racked up nearly $10,000 in charges, including a shopping spree at a high-end boutique and several weekends at a luxury hotel. I immediately reported the fraud and worked with a lawyer to clear Luke's name. Thankfully, the credit card company removed the charges, but the damage was done. Luke was devastated, not just by the financial mess, but by the realization that his own mother had betrayed him. It was a painful but necessary lesson about why I'd been so careful to protect their financial future. 13 years after the divorce, I'm proud of what I've managed to build for my kids. The savings accounts and college funds are intact, despite Sophie's best efforts to undermine them. Alice is applying to top-tier universities, and Luke is thriving in high school, dreaming of becoming an engineer. They know I'll always have their backs, no matter what. If you told me years ago that my ex-wife, Sophie, would someday ask me for child support, I would have laughed. Not because the idea was funny, but because it was absurd. We'd finalized our divorce 13 years ago, agreed on no alimony, split custody of our kids evenly, and even set up an arrangement to share their expenses equally. But Sophie has always had a way of turning logic on its head when it suits her, and this time, she took it to a whole new level. It started with a phone call. I hadn't heard Sophie's voice in weeks, which was rare since we usually communicated about Alice and Luke at least a few times a month. She sounded unusually upbeat, which immediately put me on edge. Sophie's cheerful moods usually meant trouble for me. "I wanted to talk to you about something," she said, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness. "It's about the kids." Whenever she used the kids as an opening line, I knew she was about to push some boundary. I braced myself. "Go on," I said cautiously. "Well, things have been a little tight financially," she began. "You know how it is with a big family. Brian and I have 4 kids now, and between daycare, school supplies, groceries, it's a lot. We're doing our best, but it's hard to make ends meet sometimes." I stayed silent, waiting for her to get to the point. Sophie hated silence. It made her uncomfortable, and she usually filled it with whatever scheme she was cooking up. "We were wondering," she continued, "if you could help us out a bit. Not a lot, just some child support for Alice and Luke. It would really take the pressure off." I was stunned. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. "Child support?" I repeated. "Sophie, we've had a custody and expense-sharing agreement for 13 years. You've never brought this up before." Her cheerful tone turned defensive. "Well, things change. You got that big settlement years ago, and you're doing fine. We're struggling, and it's for the kids. Don't you care about their well-being?" I felt my jaw tighten. Of course I care about their well-being. That's why I've been paying for nearly everything they need for years. Remember Alice's STEM program? Luke's braces? The countless times you forgot to pay your share? That's ancient history, she snapped. I'm talking about now. We're drowning here, and you have the means to help. Her audacity left me speechless. Sophie had spent years dodging her financial responsibilities when it came to Alice and Luke, and now she had the nerve to ask me for money, not just for our kids, but to prop up her new family with Brian? Out of curiosity and a bit of morbid fascination, I asked, "What exactly are you dealing with financially?" She hesitated, then launched into a laundry list of woes. Brian had lost his job a few months ago and was struggling to find steady work. Their mortgage was behind by 2 months, and they were at risk of losing their house. One of their younger kids had a medical condition that required expensive treatments, and Sophie's job as a part-time administrative assistant barely covered the basics. I could feel my anger bubbling to the surface. "Sophie, I'm sorry you're going through this, but child support isn't going to fix your financial problems. And frankly, it's not my responsibility to fund your household." Her voice turned cold. "So that's it? You're just going to let your kids suffer because you're too bitter to help?" That's when I lost it. "Don't you dare try to guilt-trip me. I've been there for Alice and Luke every step of the way, financially and emotionally. Can you say the same? Where was your support when Alice needed braces or when Luke needed a new laptop for school? You're not asking for help for them. You're asking for a bailout for your life choices. The line went quiet for a moment, and then she hung up. I thought that was the end of it, but of course, with Sophie, it never is. A week later, I got an email from Brian. I was surprised he even had my contact info, but Sophie must have given it to him. His tone was polite but firm, like he was trying to be the reasonable one in the situation. He explained how difficult things had been for their family and how much it would mean if I could contribute to the kids' upbringing. He even threw in a line about how it takes a village to raise children. The audacity of it all was mind-boggling. This man, who had 4 kids with Sophie, none of whom were mine, was asking me to pay child support for Alice and Luke, as if that money wouldn't just end up covering his mortgage or grocery bills. I didn't bother responding. I forwarded the email to my lawyer instead. The legal angle was clear. Sophie had no grounds to demand child support. Our custody arrangement and financial agreement were rock solid. But that didn't stop her from trying to manipulate the situation. Over the next few weeks, she called several more times, alternating between begging, guilt-tripping, and outright threats. One night, she even had Alice call me, clearly coached, to ask if I could help Mom and Brian so things aren't so stressful at home. That was the last straw. I sat Alice down the next day and explained, as gently as I could, that her mother's financial struggles had nothing to do with me and that I was already doing everything I could to support her and Luke. She seemed to understand, but it broke my heart to see her caught in the middle of Sophie's schemes. Things escalated when Sophie and Brian showed up at my house unannounced. I was outside mowing the lawn when their car pulled into my driveway. Sophie got out first, followed by Brian, who looked sheepish but determined. "Sophie, this isn't the time or place," I said, trying to keep my cool. "We just want to talk," she insisted, her voice tinged with desperation. "Face to face. Please." I reluctantly agreed, but the conversation quickly turned into a heated argument. Sophie accused me of being selfish and vindictive, while Brian tried to play mediator, which only made things worse. At one point, Sophie burst into tears, claiming they'd have to move into a shelter if I didn't help. I stood my ground. "Sophie, I'm sorry you're in this situation, but I'm not your safety net. You and Brian need to figure this out. My priority is Alice and Luke, and I'll continue to support them as I always have. But I won't be bullied into funding your life." They left shortly after, Sophie sobbing and Brian muttering something about how he thought I'd be more understanding. The whole ordeal was exhausting, but it reaffirmed what I'd known all along. Sophie will always put her own interests first, even if it means using our kids as pawns. As painful as it is to deal with her antics, I refuse to let her drag me, or Alice and Luke, into her mess. A few weeks after Sophie and Brian's desperate plea for financial help ended in disaster, I thought things might finally calm down. I'd made it abundantly clear that I wasn't responsible for fixing their financial mess. But, as I should have known, Sophie wasn't the type to back down. Instead of dropping it, she doubled down, with a new, even more outrageous plan to manipulate me. It started with a phone call from Alice. She sounded unusually nervous, which immediately put me on high alert. "Dad," she began hesitantly, "Mom and Brian have been talking about something, and they want to have a family meeting. Like, with all of us." I frowned. A family meeting involving Sophie was never a good sign. "What's it about?" I asked. She hesitated. "I'm not totally sure, but I think it has something to do with the money you've been saving for me and Luke. Mom keeps saying it's not fair that Brian's kids don't have the same opportunities." That was all I needed to hear. My stomach tightened with anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Alice, listen to me. Whatever your mom and Brian are planning, the money I've saved is for you and Luke. No one else. That's not going to change." "I know, Dad," she said quickly. "I just thought you should know what they're saying. It's been really weird around here lately." I reassured her that everything would be fine, but as soon as we hung up, I felt a mix of rage and disbelief. Sophie and Brian had no right to even think about the savings accounts I'd worked so hard to build for Alice and Luke, let alone try to involve the kids in their schemes. I knew I had to nip this in the bud before it spiraled out of control. A few days later, Sophie called me herself. This time, she didn't bother with fake pleasantries. She launched straight into her pitch. "We need to talk about the savings accounts you've set up for Alice and Luke," she said bluntly. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, my voice cold. "That money is for their future. Period." "You're being selfish," she snapped. "Brian and I are trying to give all our kids a fair shot in life, but we're drowning here. It's not like you're using that money right now. What difference would it make to share some of it with Brian's kids?" I couldn't believe the audacity of what I was hearing. "Sophie, that money has nothing to do with Brian or his kids. I saved it for Alice and Luke because I knew you couldn't be trusted to contribute. And now you're proving me right." She ignored the insult and kept pushing. "They're siblings, for God's sake. Don't you think it's going to cause resentment if two of them get everything handed to them while the others get nothing? This isn't just about money. It's about family harmony." I let out a bitter laugh. "Family harmony? Are you serious? You've spent years undermining me at every turn, and now you want to play the united family card? That's rich, Sophie." Her voice grew shrill. "I'm trying to do what's best for everyone. You're the one being petty and stubborn." "I'm protecting my kids," I shot back, "and I won't let you or Brian take what belongs to them." End of discussion. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking with anger. But of course, Sophie didn't take no for an answer. Over the next few weeks, she and Brian tried every trick in the book to pressure me. They called, texted, and even showed up at my house unannounced, always with the same argument about fairness and family. At one point, Brian even had the nerve to suggest we formalize a legal agreement to split the savings equally among all the kids. "It's not about taking anything away from Alice and Luke," he said, trying to sound reasonable. "It's about making sure everyone has a chance to succeed." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're talking about taking money that I earned and saved for my kids to give to children who aren't even mine. How is that reasonable?" "They're your kids' siblings," he countered. "Don't you want them to grow up feeling equal?" "This isn't about equality," I snapped. "It's about you and Sophie trying to solve your financial problems at my expense." The answer is no. It will always be no. As frustrating as their direct attempts were, what really enraged me was how they started involving Alice and Luke. Sophie had always been good at manipulating people, and now she was turning her tactics on our kids. She'd framed the situation as a moral dilemma, saying things like, "Don't you think it's unfair that you and Luke have so much while your brothers and sisters have so little?" Alice, to her credit, saw through it. She told me she hated the way her mom was trying to make her feel guilty. "It's not my fault they're in this situation," she said one night, tears in her eyes. "I didn't ask for any of this." Luke, being younger and more impressionable, was harder to shield. Sophie's constant guilt-tripping started to affect him, and he began asking me questions I never thought I'd hear. "Dad, do you think we should share the money? I don't want Mom to be upset." Hearing that broke my heart. I sat him down and explained, as gently as I could, that the money was for him and Alice because it was my job as their father to make sure they were taken care of. "You don't need to worry about what your mom says," I told him. "This isn't your responsibility." But Sophie wasn't done yet. Her most shocking move came a few weeks later when I received a letter from her lawyer. She was trying to take me to court, claiming that the savings accounts should be considered marital property since I'd started them while we were still technically married. It was a ridiculous argument. Our divorce settlement had already addressed all financial matters, but it was enough to drag me into another legal battle. Thankfully, my lawyer was confident we'd win. He pointed out that the accounts were in my name, funded solely with my income and the settlement for my injury, both of which were explicitly excluded from the divorce agreement. But even with the law on my side, the process was stressful and expensive. Every court appearance, every filing fee, every hour spent preparing my case felt like another slap in the face. In the end, the judge dismissed Sophie's claim, ruling that she had no legal right to the savings accounts. It was a huge relief, but the damage had already been done. Sophie's actions had driven an even deeper wedge between her and the kids, particularly Alice. "She cares more about money than she does about us," Alice said bitterly one night. "I don't even want to stay at her house anymore." It was a heartbreaking thing to hear, but I couldn't blame her. Sophie's manipulation had backfired spectacularly, leaving her relationship with our kids in tatters. As much as I wanted to shield Alice and Luke from her toxic behavior, some lessons could only be learned the hard way. It wasn't long after Sophie's failed attempt to claim Alice and Luke's savings accounts in court that she found a new way to stir up chaos. When she realized she couldn't get to me legally, she turned her focus on the kids. This time, her tactics were even more insidious, manipulating Alice and Luke directly, trying to make them feel responsible for the financial struggles of her new family. It all started when Alice came home after one of her custody weeks with Sophie. She looked upset, her usual bubbly demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic quietness. At first, I thought she was just tired, but when I asked if everything was okay, she hesitated. "Mom's been saying some stuff," she admitted, "about the money you've saved for me." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "What kind of stuff?" I asked. "She keeps talking about how hard things are for her and Brian," Alice said, avoiding my eyes. "She said it's not fair that I have all this money saved up while my half-siblings have nothing. She wants me to share it with them." I could feel my blood pressure rising, but I forced myself to stay calm for Alice's sake. "What did you say to her?" "I told her it's not my money to give away," Alice said quickly. "I told her you saved it for me for college, or whatever I need." But she wouldn't drop it. She kept saying things like, "Don't you care about your brothers and sisters? And if you really love them, you want to help." It made me feel awful. Hearing that broke my heart. Sophie had crossed so many lines over the years, but dragging Alice into her financial mess was a new low. I reassured Alice that she wasn't responsible for her mom's situation or her half-siblings' needs. "That money is yours," I told her firmly. "It's for your future. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty about that." Alice nodded, but I could see the weight of Sophie's manipulation still lingering in her eyes. As much as I wanted to shield her from this, I knew Sophie wouldn't stop, and I was right. The next week, Sophie tried a different approach. She started framing the situation as a teachable moment for Alice. "Your dad may have saved that money, but it's important to learn how to be generous," Sophie told her, according to what Alice later recounted to me. "Life isn't fair, and sometimes you have to step up and help those who have less." Alice was smart enough to see through the act, but it didn't make it any less exhausting for her. "She makes me feel like I'm a bad person for saying no," Alice told me one night, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what to do, Dad." "You don't owe anyone an explanation," I said, pulling her into a hug. "Your mom's choices aren't your responsibility. I'll talk to her." But when I confronted Sophie about it, she doubled down. "I'm just trying to teach her empathy," she said smugly. "You're the one raising her to be selfish." "Empathy?" I shot back. "You're trying to guilt-trip her into giving away money that doesn't belong to you. That's not empathy. That's manipulation." The argument escalated, as it always did with Sophie, but I refused to back down. I made it clear that if she continued to pressure Alice, I'd take legal action to limit her influence. Sophie scoffed at the threat, but I could tell it rattled her. Unfortunately, her attention soon shifted to Luke. At 14, he was more impressionable than Alice and less equipped to see through Sophie's manipulations. One day, he came home and asked me point-blank, "Dad, do you think we should help Mom and Brian?" The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask that?" I said carefully. "Mom keeps saying how hard things are for them," Luke explained. "She said Brian's been working so much overtime, and they still can't keep up with the bills. She said if we helped out, maybe they wouldn't have to sell the house." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my anger in check. Sophie had no right to burden Luke with adult problems, let alone make him feel responsible for her financial stability. "Luke, listen to me," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You are not responsible for your mom's choices or her finances. Your job is to focus on school, your friends, and being a kid. Let me handle the rest." "But what if they lose the house?" he asked, his voice small. "That's not on you," I said firmly. "It's on your mom and Brian to figure out how to fix their situation. You and Alice have your own futures to think about, and I'm here to make sure you have what you need." He nodded, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. Sophie's guilt-tripping had already taken root. Over the next few weeks, Sophie's pressure tactics escalated. She started comparing Alice and Luke to their half-siblings, saying things like, Your brothers and sisters would do anything for you. Why can't you do the same for them? She even tried to involve Brian's oldest son, Kevin, who was 16 and close in age to Alice. Kevin looks up to you, Sophie told Alice one day. He's been working after school to help out with groceries. Don't you think it's unfair that he has to work so hard while you have all this money sitting in an account? When Alice told me about this, I was livid. Sophie was turning the kids against each other, trying to create a sense of obligation where none existed. I knew I had to put a stop to it. I called Sophie and laid down the law. If you don't stop manipulating Alice and Luke, I will file for full custody, I said. You've crossed the line, Sophie. This is not about teaching them empathy. This is about you trying to fix your mistakes by making them feel guilty. Sophie laughed bitterly. You'd love that, wouldn't you? Taking the kids away from me so you can be the hero. This isn't about me, I said through gritted teeth. It's about protecting our children from your toxic behavior. But even with the threat of legal action looming, Sophie didn't stop. She started using more subtle tactics, like having her younger kids ask Alice and Luke for help directly. One day, Alice came home visibly shaken. Mom had Ethan. He's only 6, Dad. Ask me why I won't help them, she said, her voice trembling. He said, Don't you love us, Alice? What was I supposed to say to that? It was a new low, even for Sophie. Using a 6-year-old to manipulate a teenager was beyond reprehensible. I immediately called my lawyer to discuss my options. I wasn't just dealing with financial manipulation anymore. This was emotional abuse, and I refused to let it continue. The moment I realized Sophie's relentless attempts to manipulate Alice and Luke had gone too far, I knew I needed to have a serious conversation with them. Sophie had been poisoning the air with guilt and pressure, making them question the stability of the future I'd worked so hard to secure for them. It was time to set the record straight. One night, after dinner, I sat Alice and Luke down in the living room. They were quiet, clearly anticipating something serious. I started by acknowledging how tough things had been lately, especially with their mom constantly dragging them into her financial issues. I need you both to understand something, I began, looking each of them in the eye. The money I've saved for you isn't just numbers in a bank account. It's your safety net. It's your chance to go to college, start your careers, or handle emergencies without worrying about how you're going to make it. That money is yours, and only yours. No one, not even your mom, has the right to take it away from you. Alice nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and anger. I just hate how she makes me feel guilty, she said softly. Like I'm doing something wrong by not helping. You're not doing anything wrong, I said firmly. You are not responsible for her choices or her family struggles. Your job is to focus on your future, and I will make sure you have the tools to succeed. Let me deal with your mom. Luke seemed less convinced. But what if they lose their house? He asked hesitantly. Mom keeps saying it's going to happen if they don't get help. That's not your burden to carry, I said gently. I know it's hard to hear, but your mom and Brian are adults. It's their responsibility to figure out their finances, not yours. You are my priority, and I promise to protect what's yours. They both seemed to relax a little after that, but I knew Sophie wasn't going to let this go easily. And sure enough, she escalated her tactics in the worst way possible, by filing a lawsuit against me. The lawsuit arrived in the mail one morning, a thick envelope filled with legal jargon and thinly veiled accusations. Sophie was demanding child support, claiming that she was the primary caregiver for Alice and Luke despite our long-standing 50-50 custody arrangement. Her argument was ludicrous, but it was clear she was banking on the court being sympathetic to her financial woes. I called my lawyer, Mark, immediately. Mark had been my ally through the original divorce proceedings, and he knew Sophie's tactics better than anyone. This is a desperation move, Mark said after reviewing the paperwork. She's hoping to scare you into a settlement, but she doesn't have a leg to stand on. You've been an equal parent from day one, and we have the documentation to prove it. Still, the thought of going back to court filled me with dread. The first time around had been a nightmare, and I hated the idea of putting Alice and Luke through more drama, but I knew I couldn't back down. If I caved now, Sophie would only keep pushing. The court process was as exhausting as I'd feared. Sophie's lawyer painted a picture of her as a struggling single mother, overwhelmed by the challenges of raising two teenagers while also caring for her four younger children. They claimed I was neglecting my financial responsibilities and that Sophie was the real primary caregiver, conveniently ignoring the fact that I'd paid for nearly every major expense for Alice and Luke over the years. Mark was prepared for all of it. He presented detailed records of my contributions, receipts for Alice's STEM program, Luke's braces, school supplies, laptops, and countless other expenses that Sophie had either refused to pay for or outright ignored. He also highlighted the numerous times Sophie had failed to uphold her end of our financial agreement, leaving me to pick up the slack. The most damning evidence, however, came from Alice herself. She had written a statement, completely unprompted, describing how I'd always been there for her and Luke, both financially and emotionally. She mentioned the times Sophie had pressured her to give up her savings and how it had made her feel. It was heartbreaking to read, but it left no doubt about who had been the stable, reliable parent. When it was Sophie's turn to testify, her narrative quickly fell apart under cross-examination. She couldn't explain why she had neglected to contribute to shared expenses or why she had repeatedly involved the kids in her financial struggles. Her attempts to paint herself as the victim only made her look more manipulative. In the end, the court sided with me. The judge ruled that I was fully fulfilling my parental responsibilities and that Sophie's financial problems were her own to solve. Her request for child support was denied, and the judge even admonished her for using the lawsuit as a means to harass me. Walking out of the courtroom that day, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The fight was over, at least for now, and Sophie had finally been held accountable for her actions. But the real victory was knowing that Alice and Luke had seen the truth for themselves. They knew I had their backs, no matter what. In the weeks following the court decision, Sophie's behavior changed dramatically. She stopped calling and texting me, and her attempts to manipulate the kids dwindled to almost nothing. It was as if she'd finally realized that her games weren't going to work anymore. Alice and Luke seemed lighter, too, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Alice threw herself into her college applications, excited about the future for the first time in months. Luke started talking about his dream of becoming an engineer, something he hadn't mentioned in a long time. Seeing them thrive made all the stress and heartache of the past few years worth it. As for me, I've continued focusing on providing for them in every way I can. The savings accounts remain untouched, growing steadily as I add to them whenever possible. I've also started teaching Alice and Luke more about managing money, hoping to give them the skills they'll need to navigate adulthood.